Living cross-culturally is not always easy. And looking back now over more than 2 decades of my life living outside my home country, there have been many times when it was tempting to quit. Many times when we've second-guessed our sense of calling, when unanswered prayer or challenges over finances or broken relationships, sickness, disappointment, discouragement, all of those things have flooded in and have been enough almost to squash our sense of calling. And therefore it's been really critical that we've had a foundation stone underneath which has held us in those times. And one of those foundation stones, and there are many, one of them is a strong sense of calling which is confirmed through guidance. And so today I've been reflecting on the Ebenezer stone in our lives of guidance, particularly at a season when we'd just been married, we were in work in the UK, we'd been living in the UK for about 3 years, this is the late 1990s, and we were preparing for a life, not just a year travelling across Africa, but a life living outside our country. And at that point we really needed something solid to stand on. So I'd finished my 1-year trip across Africa, returned to Miranda, we had a wonderful reunion. We had spent a year apart with 3 weeks together at Christmas. It had been hard. At many times we had wanted to take an easy option. Miranda had visited me for 3 weeks at Christmas in Cameroon, and it was so tempting to get married on the beach and for her to quit university and stay. But we felt, underneath it all, we really felt that actually we needed to do what God had given us both to do. And for her, that meant returning to England. So we carried on that year. It wasn't an easy year for either of us. We carried on writing letters to each other, carried on communicating, and that actually added something to our relationship, I feel, in the long term, that communication. And even now, as I have spent several days reading hundreds of letters, and reliving those experiences, I'm actually very grateful. If nothing else, I'm grateful for those letters. I'm grateful for the lessons we learned being apart. I'm also grateful that we spent a lot of time journaling, not only our letters, all of our lives we've journaled. And last night and today I've been looking at journals from 96, 97. We left the UK finally in the summer of 1998. And our journals from that time were quite complete and quite full, which is great. I was reflecting earlier on the verse in Habakkuk where it talks about writing down the vision so that a herald may run with it. There's something really good about writing down our vision, writing down our feelings, writing down the words that we've had spoken into our lives, our sense of guidance, and actually having something that we can run with, which will enable us to run the race with perseverance. And that's really my Ebenezer story today, is about being able to run with perseverance because you've written down the vision, you've written down your sense of confirmation, your sense of guidance. So we both knew separately before we met, before we got married, that we're very unlikely to live our lives in the UK. We both felt separately that we would probably be based in Africa for much of our lives. So when we got married back in 93, it was with a sense that that's where we were heading. We spent 6 months, kind of like a second honeymoon in 1994, travelling around 7 countries in Eastern and South Central Africa. Wonderful time. We'd gone there with the I suppose, naive feeling that maybe we would find somewhere in those 5-6 months. We would land somewhere and feel, yes, this is where we want to spend our lives. That didn't happen. And so we returned to the UK and we settled into more further training and work. I qualified as a school teacher. Miranda was working as a charities fundraiser, and we just worked. We got settled in a local church. We built relationships. We had some responsibility. We were leading house groups. We built actually a solid platform, a sending platform, which was really important for later. We built good relationships in those years. Those 6 months in Africa, whilst we didn't find a destination, we did find a heart home, which was very interesting. And in a sense, it was almost coincidental. We visited a YWAM team in Uganda, where a friend was working on a short-term trip. We visited there initially for just 1 night, but Miranda got quite sick, and we ended up staying 3 or 4 days while she was recovering, and I teamed up with this local team. Really enjoyed it. And so when she was feeling better, they suggested, why don't you just stay for the next 2 or 3 weeks? So we did. We stayed 3 weeks and we had a really wonderful time. And in our 6 months of travel, we experienced lots of things. We saw places where we recognised we didn't want to live the way we saw things lived. We saw lots of places where foreigners were completely in charge. We saw most places where men were totally in charge. And in this YWAM team in Uganda, we were in a place where we saw black Africans and white Europeans working hand in hand. We saw men and women working hand in hand. We saw women in leadership. And we had a wonderful moment as we were leaving when the Ugandan leader of the team took us into his office. And he just spent 10 minutes doing something he didn't need to do. He didn't know us well, but he took us into his office, two young adults, and he affirmed us. And he spoke into our lives. And he confirmed a sense of calling that we already had to Africa. He spoke over us and said, I can see you have a heart for the continent. It looks to me like God is calling you here. If ever you want to come back, there's a warm welcome for you. And he affirmed this sense of calling. No one else had done that in quite that way for us until that point in our lives. And it was very meaningful to have it coming from a Ugandan. And so when we were back in England, that was a fond memory of YWAM and a fond memory of seeing women, Africans, men, Westerners, all sorts working in real unity and in team leadership, something that we were really drawn to. So we're back in the UK now. We had been there several years and we were thinking, where are we going? When are we going? We were kind of itching to go, but feeling we needed to stay for now. And this feeling was always there. It didn't go away. We were often talking, where do you think we'll go? When will we go? What do we need to do? How do we get ready? And this went on for 2 or 3 years. And then one day, almost unexpectedly, out of the blue, there was a prophetic word in our church. And this word essentially, this was, I guess, the beginning of 1997. This word was about taking the vision off the wall and holding it close to your heart. And the person interpreted this and said that he felt there were people there who had a vision for the future, which in a sense was like a picture which they'd framed and it was on their wall. And now was the time to take this picture down and God was going to breathe life into it. One of our close friends who was in our house group came up to us immediately afterwards and said, I felt that was for you. And immediately I thought of your map of Africa, which you've got on your wall. And I felt God was saying it's time to take the map down and hold it close to you. And that really chimed with both of us. A couple of months later, we visited some very close friends who a Zimbabwean married to a British woman who were based in Zimbabwe working with YWAM, preparing to start a project in Mozambique. And they'd come to England for 2 years for training. We visited them over a weekend in Nuneaton at the YWAM base. This is now March 1997. And even as we went there, we knew that we were going to a place that had been preparing and sending people to work overseas for many, many years. And we felt this is the kind of place where God can speak to us. So we went very expectant that he would. On our very first day there, I was reading in a devotional book. And I was reading about the Macedonian call that Paul had. And this devotion said that sometimes strategic doors are opened just for a short period of time. When they're opened, you need to go through them because it's God who's opened the door for you. Later that day, we were talking with our friends and they were talking about their vision for the team that they were hoping to establish in YWAM Mozambique. They were saying that the place they were going to was a strategic place. It was a doorway into the unreached parts of the Zambezi Delta. They used that exact same phrase, a doorway. On our way back home, we'd bought The Guardian, the newspaper, and we were reading it, and we came across an article written by a journalist who was doing an Alpha course. He quoted the vicar on this Alpha course, who said that God speaks through often seeming coincidences, and this is one way God spoke to us. So look at coincidences. That phrase was in our mind. We were talking about, that's really interesting, isn't it? When we got home that night, over previous weeks we had been writing to lots of different organisations asking for information about Africa, possible openings. And anyway, when we opened our door, this was back when we used to get lots of letters before emails, we had a big A4 envelope on our doormat from a group called OM. We opened it up and there was a large flyer with a map of Africa with Mozambique on the side clearly marked, and in the middle of Africa a door that was open, and underneath it simply said Mozambique, an open door, who will go? So we had all these things that came together over a weekend that really felt like God was speaking something. So we then thought, well, maybe we should team up with this couple. They're YWAM. that would mean us joining YWAM. We would go to Mozambique. There was another element woven into this, which was that two other very close friends who were living close to us were preparing also at the same time to go to live in Mozambique. At that point, we were both working, Miranda and I. We had money that we were earning regularly, and so we had begun to give a monthly gift to our close friends who were preparing to go to Mozambique. Because we were giving money to them, we were also kind of emotionally involved. We were praying for them often. It's interesting that there's a principle that Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And we found that even as we began to financially give and support our friends, it was putting something of our heart into them. And as we began to pray for them, we didn't just pray for them, we prayed for Mozambique. Because both of us love reading, we wanted to know more about this country we were praying for. We went to the library, we went to the bookshop, we searched for books. I bought plenty of books on Mozambique, Confronting Leviathan, Kalashnikovs and Zombie Cucumbers was the name of another one. The Harrowing of Mozambique. Traumatic titles because Mozambique had been through a traumatic past. And as I began to read these books, I was deeply moved. I learned something, and because I was a history teacher at the time, I was fascinated by the history of Mozambique. I began to learn about what Mozambique had been through. I learnt about the colonial period, about the Portuguese. I learnt about the war for independence in the late 60s and 70s, with Mozambicans wanting independence from Portugal, Portuguese not giving it freely, and so these people fighting for their independence, and how they were drawn to a Marxist ideology because of their desire for freedom. And naturally, words of Marx, things like workers of the world unite, what have you got to lose but your chains, that kind of communist ideals spoke to Mozambicans who had been colonized and oppressively ruled for decades and decades. And so after independence in 1975, the new government of Mozambique was naturally very left-wing, a Marxist government, supported through their war for independence by the USSR, by East Germany. I read about the neighbouring nation, which at that point was Rhodesia, now called Zimbabwe, a white supremacist-led government. They didn't want a Marxist country on their neighbouring side that would support the black Zimbabweans' fight for independence. So they began to fund and create and arm a guerrilla insurrectionist movement called Renamo. In 1980, Zimbabwe changed. They got independence. It was no longer Rhodesia. The white supremacist government was over. And then, tragically, the country to the south, South Africa, also a white supremacist government, began to fund this same group because the Marxist government of Mozambique was a natural, safe place for the rebel groups like the ANC. And then later, as South Africa began to move itself towards independence, more and more the big arms producers of the West, Britain, and particularly America during Ronald Reagan's era, were funding this guerrilla movement in Mozambique. Russia, East Germany, funding the Marxist government, and this Cold War being fought out in Mozambique. So by 1992-93, Mozambique was one of the poorest countries in the world. It had had 25, 30 years of almost continual war. It was like a football that had been kicked around by the great powers. And as I read this, it made me angry. Angry at the UK, angry at Reagan, angry at America, angry at deep, deep injustice, angry at the communist countries, but angry that the poor of the world were losing out. And that passion that it ignited in me, I felt was something from the Lord. Now, people would disagree with my politics, naturally, and that's okay. But even as I read passages like Isaiah 58, about true fasting being loosing the chains of injustice, breaking the yoke on the oppressed, sharing your food with the hungry, all these things were coming together. The things I was reading was making me fascinated in the country. My passion was being stirred up. God was speaking to us through prophetic words. And it felt like all of those things were kind of coming together in a weaving of these ropes. And it was as if I recognised eventually that Mozambique, the most unreached country in sub-Saharan Africa, that one of the poorest nations in the world, with millions of landmines, with a struggling economy in the mid-90s as it rebuilt after years of war, it was as if I could see there is an open door. Who will go? Would I be the answer to my own prayers? And through that, I learned a really key principle. I learned, first of all, that passion is important. It's really interesting when we read in Matthew chapter 9, verses 36 to 37, 38. Jesus was compassionate when he saw the crowds. They were harassed and helpless like sheep without shepherd. He was stirred up by it. He spoke to the disciples. He said, look, the harvest is great and the workers are few. He opened their eyes to the needs in the harvest. And he said, therefore, pray that the Lord of the harvest would send out workers. So he saw the need. He was passionate. He educated the disciples. He showed them the need. And then he told them to pray. And then at the start of chapter 10 of Matthew, we see that he drew the disciples to him and he then sent them out in pairs, saying, go out to the lost sheep. And as you go, ... So we see that he awakened them to the need through his own compassion. He told them to pray about the need, and then he told them to go. And it's as if all three of those elements were needed. He awakened compassion, he got them praying that the Lord of the harvest would send people out, and then through this prayer, actually they recognised that they were the answer to their own prayers. So then he sent the people who had been praying themselves. It was only really in the years to come that I recognised that's what had happened in us. As we had given finances to our friends, as we had prayed for them, as we had read and educated ourselves, everything in us was being stirred up so that we were eventually ready to become an answer to our own prayers. And so we'd returned from this weekend in Nuneaton. All of these things were coming together. We actually had a very interesting visit a few weeks later from a senior YWAM leader who came to our church, and we told him what we were thinking, and he said, well, if I could give you one piece of advice, it would be to draw together a group of friends and ask them to pray with you about this. So we did that. We gathered together a group of maybe 12 or 15 very close friends and family and our church leaders, and we had a meal, and we told them that this unfolding vision. They gathered around us, they prayed, and there was a strong sense of confirmation from this group that God seemed to be in this and that God seemed to be leading us and that we should take the next step forward. So we asked the group if they would be willing to meet the following month. And actually over the next 6, 8, 10 months, we met monthly with this group, and it became a monthly prayer group. But that group became a place. It was not only a sort of a sounding board for our ideas, it became a kind of a real place of confirmation for us. So that when we finally left the UK, we left knowing that we had a strong group of people who had a real sense of ownership of us and our sense of calling. And not only ownership, they felt responsible as well, because they had been confirming, yeah, this is right, we feel God is in this, do this. And so through this, I felt like we learnt so many things. And this was a real Ebenezer moment for us, and we've gone back to it many, many times in our lives since. This was an Ebenezer moment because God really helped us. God spoke to us very clearly. And I could see that in this kind of rope, there were many strands. There was the strand of personal passion. There was a strand of the context of our lives and the general direction it was going in. There was the strand of clear prophetic word. There was the strand of confirmation through friends. And there was the strand of strong personal conviction and the power of agreement that the two of us together felt, yes, this is right. And so now I'm always a bit wary when I hear people hanging their whole life on one single word. It feels like, particularly when we're looking at really major life-changing decisions, we can trust for very clear guidance that is confirmed through multiple sources. And if we have that, that will prove to be an immense Ebenezer, an immense memorial stone, something we can look back on many times in the years to come to say, yes, I know that at that point, God spoke to me, God helped me, God led me. And therefore, I can trust that strong foundation.